subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. Seneca was, by the ancient historian Tacitus's own account, one of the richest private citizens in the entire Roman Empire, a fortune estimated at roughly 300 million sesterces, built from his years as tutor and then advisor to the Emperor Nero. He was also, at the very same time, the empire's most widely read author on the worthlessness of wealth. Critics noticed the contradiction while he was still alive. This video is about how he actually answered them, not by pretending the fortune didn't exist, but by explaining exactly what he thought it was for. Seneca's own defense survives in his essay on the happy life, translated here by Aubrey Stewart. He doesn't deny the charge. He reframes it, "I will despise riches when I have them, no less than if I have them not." His argument was that the crime isn't possessing money, it's needing it, being rearranged by the fear of losing it. Elsewhere, in a letter to his friend Lucilius, he puts the same idea more sharply: it is not the man who has little, but the man who craves more, that is poor. By that definition, a poor man can own a fortune, and a rich man can own nothing at all. Seneca's argument had a practical side too, not just a defense of ownership. In a letter to Lucilius on the same subject, translated by Gummere, he lays out an actual standard for daily living: let your dress be neither mean nor gorgeous. He wasn't preaching poverty as a virtue in itself, he thought performing poverty for an audience was its own kind of vanity, just aimed in the opposite direction from luxury. The goal wasn't the ivory tables or their absence. It was being equally undisturbed whether the tables stayed or were sold tomorrow. Long before any of that fortune existed, Seneca had already been stripped of everything once. In the year 41, under the Emperor Claudius, he was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, the emperor's own sister, almost certainly at the instigation of the Empress Messalina, who saw him as a political threat. He was exiled to the island of Corsica for 8 years, cut off from Roman public life entirely, and it was there, with nothing left to defend, that he wrote some of his sharpest essays on how to actually bear loss. The man who later owned 500 ivory-legged tables had, a decade earlier, owned a stretch of rock in the Mediterranean and very little else. He knew both conditions personally, which is at least part of why his writing on wealth reads less like theory and more like a man comparing notes across the two extremes he'd actually lived through. Whether Seneca actually lived up to his own standard is a fair question, and one Romans asked out loud during his lifetime. He kept 500 matching ivory-legged tables in his dining rooms, according to the historian Cassius Dio. He owned villas across Italy. None of that squares easily with an essay on contempt for luxury, and Seneca knew it, which is part of why he kept returning to the argument instead of dropping it. The uncomfortable center of Seneca's story isn't the money, though. It's what the money was actually attached to. As Nero's advisor, Seneca held real influence over an emperor who grew, year by year, more erratic and more dangerous. When Nero had his own mother Agrippina murdered in the year 59, it was Seneca who helped compose the letter justifying it to the Senate. A Stoic philosopher, writing cover for a matricide, to protect the regime that had made him one of the richest men alive. His own writing on virtue didn't stop him from doing it. This isn't a detail his admirers tend to lead with, but it belongs in his story, because it's the clearest evidence of exactly what wealth and proximity to power can cost a person who claims to already know better. By the year 62, with Nero's court turning openly hostile toward him, Seneca tried to walk away from all of it. Tacitus records the scene. Seneca approached the emperor and offered to hand back the entire fortune, the gardens, the villas, everything Nero had given him over the years, in exchange for permission to retire from public life. Nero refused the gift and, with false warmth, insisted Seneca keep it all. Seneca withdrew from the court as much as he safely could anyway, spending his final years writing letters to Lucilius about how to actually live rather than how to hold on to influence. It didn't save him. In the year 65, a conspiracy against Nero was uncovered, and though the evidence against Seneca was thin, Nero used it as the excuse he'd apparently been waiting for. He sent an officer to Seneca's villa with an order: end your own life. According to Tacitus's account, Seneca received the news calmly, asked to update his will, and was refused even that. He turned to the friends gathered around him and, seeing them in tears, asked them a pointed question: where had their philosophy gone, and their years of preparing for exactly this moment? He opened the veins in his arms and legs. Old age and a thin frame slowed the bleeding, so he asked for poison as well, and then finally had himself carried into a hot bath to speed the process, dictating his last thoughts to secretaries the entire time. His wife Paulina tried to die alongside him and was saved, against her wishes, on Nero's orders. Seneca did not. There's a version of this story that treats the ending as proof the earlier compromises never mattered, a clean, philosophical death that erases an uglier life. That's too easy. The more honest reading is that Seneca spent decades getting the argument partly right and partly wrong at the same time: right that money itself isn't the danger, wrong about how much of himself he'd trade to keep standing next to it. His own test, the man who craves more is the poor one, whatever his balance says, applied to him as much as to anyone he ever wrote it for. He seems to have known that. He wrote about it anyway, for the same reason a person keeps a scale in the house even after learning their own weight, not because he'd passed the test, but because he hadn't stopped taking it. That's the version of Seneca worth remembering, not the marble bust of a serene sage, and not the caricature of a hypocrite who preached poverty from a couch. A man who'd been exiled with nothing, then handed almost everything, then asked to give it back and been refused, and who spent the years in between trying, imperfectly, to work out which parts of a fortune actually belonged to the person holding it, and which parts were only ever on loan. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.